Brush control is usually treated as the most important skill in miniature painting, and if you don't have it, painting feels slow, frustrating and out of reach. But what if I told you you can build this much texture and detail without brush control at all? In this video, I'll show you how I painted a full model using beginner-friendly techniques and a few smart decisions at each step. But before putting any paint on the model, I started by applying a thin layer of diluted texture paste. The goal here was simple: to enhance the surface detail and push the rusty, corroded look even further. I have done this before using literal dirt from the garden, with great results. But since I recently bought this diorama effects texture for an upcoming video, I figured this was a good opportunity to try it out. Hobby products aren't cheap, so I always try to get as much use out of them as possible. Once it dried, I was honestly very happy with the result. All the micro texture left behind didn't disappoint at all, and is going to do a lot for the model later when we start painting. When it came time to base coat the model, I started with the metallics as they cover most of the model itself. For this, I mixed a standard metallic paint with a bit of brown ink. This gave me a darker, dirtier metal to work from. A solid starting point for the rusty look I'm after. That said, feel free to use a normal acrylic paint instead. The main objective here was simply to differentiate the base coat from the metallic layers used later on due to the step coming ahead. Now we get to the most important part of this entire paint job, the one that allows us to build texture and detail without relying on brush control at all. And for that, the only thing we need is a sponge. At its core, sponging is very simple. It lets you create lots of random dots of different sizes very quickly, which is perfect for things like corrosion, pitting and worn textures in general. That said, metallics over metallics aren't the best way to visually showcase this, because all of the reflectiveness can make the effect harder to read at first. But rest assured, what we are doing here will have a clearer impact later on. Before you start sponging yourself, there are two very important things to keep in mind. The first thing I am showing here on the palette, and it is how I unload excess paint and test the pattern. You want the dots to be small and sparse. It is very easy to pick up too much paint or for the sponge to absorb it without us noticing, and end up stamping a big blob on the model. So always test on the palette first before moving on to the miniature. The second thing to keep in mind is pressure. Because we are working with very small amounts of paint spread across the sponge, that paint can dry quickly, and when nothing seems to be happening, it's very tempting to press harder. That is usually when things go wrong. Pressing too hard can once again leave a big stain on the model, instead of the random textures we are after. So the key is to go back and forth between the palette and the model, always with a light touch, and constantly checking that the paint is coming out the way you want it to. At this stage, the texture is definitely there, but it's hard to see because everything is still very shiny. However, that changes once we start washing, and begin putting the rust onto this metal. While there are dedicated rust products out there, I like to keep things simple. For this, I use a mix of reddish brown, dark brown, and later on some orange. Each wash is roughly 1 part paint to 4 parts water. I start by washing the entire surface with a reddish tone. This immediately knocks back the shine and start tying everything together. Normally, you would start with the darkest brown, then move into the reddish brown and finish with orange. But metallic paints make washes behave a bit differently. Because they are glossier, the first wash you apply tends to flow much more into the recesses than the ones that come after. So in cases like these, I always swap the order. By starting with a reddish wash, I get more red sitting in the recesses, while the overall surface stays darker and browner later on. Partly because the reddish wash makes the surface less slippery. But before moving into the dark brown wash, I do another pass with a sponge. And this is where the magic really starts to happen. You see, washes always tint the surface they are applied to at least a little. That might sound obvious, but it's incredibly important here. What this means is that instead of needing multiple metallic paints, darker ones, lighter ones or different tones, to build up detail and complexity, I can keep using the same metallic color and let the washes do the work. While each layer of sponging is technically the same paint, because it is applied between tinted layers, it reads as something completely different each time. All these layers interact with one another, creating depth and variation without ever needing precision or control. This is one of the many approaches I want to explore more in the future. Ways to achieve great results by making educated decisions while using beginner-friendly techniques that require little to no skill. The dark brown wash will also set up space for a third sponging layer, which again looks different from the ones below it, even though it's the same paint. But before the final sponging pass, I added a bit of orange to my reddish wash and targeted the most corroded areas of the model. This pushes the rust even further and helps guide the viewer's eye. All of this was done with a very old beat-up brush, nothing fancy. Further washes were applied afterwards, adding more orange to the mix. But I always kept the lighter washes within those initial areas where I intentionally chose to push the corrosion. Yet I didn't push the color into yellow tones or even pure orange. Lightly reaching into the oranges was enough to enhance the effect without it becoming over the top and keeping a more restrained look overall. Afterwards, I finished off with a final sponging of metallic paint. These represent the most recent chips and dings on the armor, and here I was extremely careful to unload most of the paint from the sponge. When you reach final highlight stages like this, less is more. With the metallics finished, it was time to move on to the cloth, and to fully commit to the challenge, I decided to keep working using only sponges and washes. I did cut the sponge in half to make it easier to work around the model, and avoid ruining the metallic areas I already worked on. Other than that, I didn't worry too much about perfect coverage. This is a secondary element of the model, and I want most of the viewer's attention to stay on the rusted metal. This ties directly to an important beginner lesson from a couple weeks ago. You don't need to push every part of the model equally. Focus your efforts on a single element, and allow everything else to support it. Most of the sponging on the cloth stayed towards the bottom, and just like with the metallics, I used a brown wash between layers to create depth and variation, in what is otherwise the same step repeated several times. While I could have repeated this process indefinitely and added as many layers as I wanted, at a certain point I stopped sponging altogether and applied 2 heavier washes on the lower part of the cloth. This finishes it off and sells the idea of dirt, grime, and the build-up over time. Thank you for watching. I hope this video showed you how far simple techniques and smart decisions can really take you. If you found it helpful, let me know in the comments and feel free to suggest other techniques or ideas you would like to see me cover in future videos.